Al-Ittijah News Channel. The truth fears no questions.
Если мы увидим, что этот беспредел начинается в Восточной...
What can be a reason to use the armed forces? This is of course the last resort, simply the last resort. If we see the lawlessness starting in eastern regions too, if people ask us for help, and we have already an official address from the current legitimate president, we reserve the right to use all options at our disposal to protect those citizens.
Наша братская...
I think the strong condemnation that it's received from countries around the world indicates the degree to which Russia's on the wrong side of history on this.
Речь идет о защите наших граждан и соотечественников.
Those who try to interpret the situation as an act of aggression, threaten us with sanctions and boycotts, are the same partners who have been constantly and vigorously encouraging the political powers close to them to declare ultimatums and renounce dialogue, to ignore the concerns of the south and east of Ukraine, and consequently to the polarization of the Ukrainian society.
But if Russia does not choose to de-escalate, if it is not willing to work directly with the government of Ukraine as we hope they will be, then our partners will have absolutely no choice but to join us to continue to expand upon steps we have taken in recent days in order to isolate Russia politically, diplomatically.
Well, events in Ukraine are developing by the day. The West has backed regime change in Kiev, leaving the country with a central government of dubious legitimacy and an economy in free fall, further fueling cessationist sentiments. Russia has made it clear it will protect Russian nationals in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Washington and its European allies warn Moscow of the costs and consequences of military action. So how far is the Kremlin willing to go, and how will the West respond? To discuss this very important issue further, I'm joined by a very special guest here tonight, His Excellency Alexander Zasipkin. He is the Russian ambassador to Beirut. A very warm welcome to you, sir. Thank you very much for joining us here tonight. Let me start by asking you, has Russia lost Ukraine to Western powers?
We believe that Ukraine is a country right in the middle of Europe. And it also has relations with Russia, and it has relations with the European countries and with the other European
But isn't Russia's decision to use military force in Ukraine a sign of weakness on the part of Russia, and a sign that Ukraine is slipping out of its orbit of influence?
This decision was made with the aim of protecting the lives of people. And so this was the honorable goal. We didn't take this step because we wanted to go ahead with a military action to intervene or to impose something on the state.
We've all heard the taped conversation between the State Department official Victoria Nuland and the U.S. ambassador in Ukraine discussing what members of the opposition should be appointed to any new government in Ukraine. But Victoria Nuland also said something very important, and I want to read it to you here. She said, and I quote, "We've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to torpedo it." Is everything that we've seen in Ukraine over the last couple of months really aimed at undermining Russia?
إلى إلحاق الأذى أو أضعاف روسيا.
هذا ما حدث
This,
ما حدث
what took
هذا
place
ليس الشيء بسيط ومثل
is not
التعيين
something simple.
هذا طبعا تدخل في الشؤون
Of course,
الداخلية
it's
من قبل
intervention.
الغرب
The West intervened in the internal affairs of Ukraine, however, in different forms.
فالمواجهة ما
The
بين
confrontation
المعارضة
between the
والسلطات
opposition
كانت
and the ruling authority in Ukraine
وبخطوط
came in
عريضة
different forms
وكانوا
and
يستخدمون
different
العنف.
lines, and they used violence.
فهذا
And so
شيء خارج
this
أي
is something
دستور أي
which is
قوانين
outside
فلذلك
any
كان
constitution
يجب على
or any law,
المجتمع
and so
الدولي
the international
أن يكون في
community
الموقف
should
الحاسم.
have taken a decisive stance. Now,
ما اللي شاهدناه
with respect to what
فهذه
we saw,
المناورات
these are maneuvers.
لإيجاد
These are all maneuvers in order to bring about a new government or to achieve the unilateral aims, and this is unacceptable.
Watching the U.S. and Russia trade bitter accusations in recent days over Ukraine, one gets the sense that the shadows of the Cold War are returning. Is Ukraine the new staging ground, or the staging ground rather, for a new Cold War?
أولا أنه نحن لا
First of
نعود
all,
إلى الحرب
we are
الباردة
not going back to the
لأنه
Cold War
هذه
era
حالة
because
طويلة الأمد
this is a long-term issue and it requires a state of alert for all parts of the state, political, economy and military. And this situation today is different than what we saw previously during the Cold War. Now, with regards to the situation in Ukraine, it's very important for Russia, and so we believe, strategically speaking, we believe that the Russian efforts must be exerted and pursued in order to reach a solution in Ukraine.
Yeah, so is, some of the rhetoric coming out of the West, in particular the Obama administration, one gets the sense that the Western leadership is not interested in a peaceful and stable Ukraine. Do you think that the West is pursuing a military development or a situation developing towards a military confrontation inside Ukraine?
I
believe, in my personal opinion, that there are different plans. They have different plans. They refer to different scenarios. And there are political aims, economic aims, and security aims. And if these aims are achieved within the framework of a unified state, this will be something which benefits the West.
What are some, if you can tell me, if I can just...
They want a government which is on good relations with the West, an economic partnership with the EU, opening the markets for the EU goods, and from the security perspective, in the future, they want Ukraine to join NATO. And if they are not able to achieve these goals, then maybe they have other alternatives. And we believe that the situation of chaos is because of their encouragement.
So isn't Russia playing into the hands of the West by relying on its military to resolve this crisis? So what I'm asking you, sir, if Russia is playing into the hands of the Western world and its enemies in Ukraine by relying on its military in order to put pressure on the government in Kiev?
The role of the army here is to reassure the people in Ukraine, those people who are afraid of the extremists, because they want these people to be reassured. The army wants them to be reassured. And so this decision is a security decision, but it also carries a moral, political importance as well. And we don't believe that we will use force, we won't use our armed forces. However, people over there, people in the eastern part of Ukraine should rest assured. They should not be afraid.
What do you say to Western leaders who argue that Russia's actions surrounding the crisis in Ukraine and the pretext for any possible military intervention is synonymous, rather, with the Soviet-era invasion of Czechoslovakia, for instance?
Of course, today we live in a new era, and our policies are different than the policies of the Soviet Union. Anyway, with respect to this issue, it's important to point out to something else, which is the behavior of the West. The West intervened in the internal affairs of Ukraine and encouraged the extremists in order to grab hold of power. And so, if they have any ideas about Russian behavior, I think it would be more appropriate to think about the Western behavior, to focus on the behavior of the West.
But where is Russia's proof that, in fact, the developments in Ukraine were fueled by Western powers? Because a lot of Western governments have argued that this is the result of a wide spectrum of the Ukrainian population protesting against what they refer to as a corrupt government.
Yes, there were protests. However, these protests also included acts of violence. Some of these protests were violent, and what we witnessed during this period of confrontation between the protesters in the square in Kiev and the police, they used force. The protesters resorted to violence, and so it's not only just as simple as protesters confronting police. This was pressure on all sides. What we saw was pressure on all sides. President Yanukovych fled as if he wanted to flee. No. Or as if all of this is to put pressure on the parliamentarians. Of course, we confess that mistakes were made. Many mistakes were made by the ruling government, the former ruling government in Ukraine. But under the Western pressures and under the pressures of the protesters, could they reach the stage on the 21st of February to transfer authority and power? And there was an agreement about normalizing all of the issues, but they didn't stop at this line, at this boundary. They continued. Even after this agreement was made, they continued with their pressure on the ruling authorities until this government was formed instead of forming a national unity government, which the agreement stipulates.
Okay, I want to come back to the protests in a little while, but going back now to this geopolitical struggle between the West and Russia when it comes to Ukraine, a lot of the threats that have been directed at Russia over the last couple of weeks remind many of the sort of rhetoric directed at Saddam Hussein's Iraq, for example, or Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. Has Russia become a rogue state in the eyes of the West?
I don't think that this term is appropriate, or this idea is correct. Maybe it's more similar to going back to the language of the Cold War, the language of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and America. Yes, it is
that
similar.
What's happening now? Are we entering that phase again? The language symbols that we are back into a Cold War era, does it not?
I don't think so, because it's too early to speak about this issue. The second point...
But I'm sorry to have to cut you off. I'm sorry to cut you off, Ambassador, but if I can just touch on a few points. There is a number of issues where the West and Russia have clashed over the last couple of years, going back as far back as 1999 over the issue of the NATO bombing in Serbia and the annexation of Kosovo, which Russia was strongly opposed to, looking at the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya through NATO's intervention, which was a loss for Russia in that region, and the present situation in Syria, where President Bashar al-Assad is under tremendous pressure from Western powers. Doesn't that signal a geopolitical struggle between Russia and the West that has now come home, has literally come to Russia's doorstep in Ukraine?
I agree that this is correct what you said, this series of events. What is taking place in Syria now, of course, is a part of the series, and what is taking place today in Ukraine, also, we could put it within the framework of being part, another episode of this series, encouraging protesters to use violence against the authorities. Even the most recent news which we heard today, we heard that snipers, possibly snipers amongst the opposition, were opening fire against all sides. And this continues, this series continues. However, at this current stage, we want to achieve a solution. And it's true. Unfortunately, we haven't been able previously, we were not able to put a barrier or to prevent the bombing of Yugoslavia or to prevent an intervention or to prevent the NATO operation in Libya. It's true we weren't able to stop that, but we must learn the lessons of the past. And so, as you know, we stood very decisively regarding Syria. We took a firm stance. And now we stood also in Georgia to protect the people in South Ossetia. And now we are also taking a decisive, firm stance in Ukraine with the same aim of protecting people.
But Ukraine is different, isn't it? Because Ukraine is on Russia's doorstep. Is there a fear in Moscow at the moment that NATO member states are essentially encircling you along your western border? Because when we look at from the time of the end of the Cold War until now, NATO expansion into Eastern Europe has been pretty significant.
Yes. Yes, of course, every subject must be addressed separately, and what is taking place in Ukraine is closer to us. It's a neighboring country and a brotherly people. And as you said, there are goals which the West wants to achieve, including the expansion of NATO, yes. So, for this reason, we are taking a firm stance.
So is this Russia's way of sending a message that it will not tolerate a Western-oriented, unfriendly Ukraine, if you will?
Yes, yes, of course. Exactly, because we won't accept this. That's why we're taking this stance. And this unique measure which we took, the unique decision which we took, the decision taken by the Russian parliament and giving the green light for the president to use force, that's why we took this decision, to send such a message. but we hope that we aren't forced to implement. However, there is a red line.
What is that red line?
ما هو خط الأحمر؟
هذا زعزعة الأوضاع
Destabilizing the situation in the eastern part of Ukraine.
Russian nationals being killed? Russian nationals being killed? Is that a red line?
الحمد لله أنه الآن يبدو
Thank God
أنه
it
صار
seems
في
now
الأوضاع أحسن.
that the situation has improved.
ولكن
However,
إذا كان هناك
if
خطر
there is any danger,
فنحن جاهزين.
we are ready.
الشيء الثاني
And the
أنه
second
نريد
point
أن
is
ننبه
we want to
ألا
caution
يلجأوا إلى
them
الاستفزازات
not to resort to provocations,
بأي شكل
not
من
to provoke
الأشكال.
us in any way whatsoever.
وهذا ممكن يكون بأشكال متنوعة.
And this
لا
could
أريد
happen
أن
in different
أتعمق
forms. They could
في
provoke us
هذا
in
الموضوع.
different ways. I don't want to go deep into it, but we warn them.
يجب نكون يقظين.
We must be vigilant.
The West has been threatening economic and diplomatic isolation for Russia if the situation in Ukraine escalates. But what can the West really do to threaten Russia's position in Ukraine?
We responded to these threats, and Russia's stance is well known. We have an evaluation. We believe that any sanctions could backfire, could have negative repercussions, and could backfire against the West, not just damage Russia, but also cause damage for the Western countries. We have highly developed economic ties with Western Europe, and they are very much intent on continuing with these economic ties. And I don't think that as a result of the decision taken by Russia, the moral decision, I don't think that this will lead them to abandoning their cooperation with us, because this will damage the vital economic interests of Europe.
But what price would be too high for the Russians? At what point would Russia reconsider its position on Ukraine? Because considering the fact that 50% of Russia's trade is with the European Union.
As I said, it's bilateral trade. And another point is the damage done if we hadn't taken this decision and if we hadn't drawn this red line, then the results would have been far worse than anything which we're witnessing today.
Okay, on that note, we are going to take a quick break now. Do stay with us.
The crisis of capitalism, the European impasse, the energy shortages, the emerging power of Asia, the economic power of the Arab world, the economic debate, informative, revealing, and progressive. It discusses the economic event of the world.
Economic debate, where the numbers reveal the truth.
Around the world, outside the mainstream, anywhere, everywhere. A media of your land, of your creation. A new media in a new era. Will it take the lead in the future? I believe so. This is Underground.
Underground, when vague turns to clarity.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, and with us to discuss this we have the Russian ambassador to Beirut. Your Excellency, let me ask you, is Russia preparing a full-scale invasion of Ukraine if the situation worsens in the eastern part of the country? Are you prepared to go into eastern Ukraine?
We cannot use the term occupying or invasion. We cannot use such terms. We cannot say what the form of using our military forces, in what form this use of military force will come. The goal is to protect people, and we must also bear in mind that the self-defense factions have been formed, the so-called self-defense factions, and we believe that in case the extremists launch any attack, these local forces, local groups will respond and retaliate and resist such an attack. And so we are not thinking about a war or something similar to war, because there is no side to wage war on, no big power to wage war on. As I said, this decision is not like the previous decisions made by NATO or others, bombings and strikes. No, here we have a very big difference. So,
nevertheless, to protect Russian nationals in eastern Ukraine, in cities like Donetsk, for instance, you have 20,000 Russian troops based in the Crimea. Would they cross over into eastern Ukraine? Would you expand your presence in the country further east?
We cannot now, we cannot speak about such developments as long as the situation in these areas is under the control of the local councils or the local authorities or the popular armed committees. So we don't see any big role for the army, for the Russian army. However, it's not beneficial to discuss this matter, because the stance taken by Russia is a stance of principle, and it's not just for the sake of declaring war.
President Putin has shown his willingness to go to war in Georgia in 2008. If we see an escalation in Ukraine, I know you've said that it's not beneficial to talk about this at this point, but if we see a further escalation of the crisis there, could we see a similar situation as we saw in Georgia and Abkhazia and South Ossetia, sort of a split between the East and the West?
Today we are speaking about this series of events which have happened in different countries. There are some similarities and there are some differences. In Georgia, for example, there was bombing. There was intense bombing on the capital of South Ossetia, and they used the army. The army launched a campaign, and for this reason we saw the reaction of the Russian army against the Georgian army. We wouldn't have went into South Ossetia if this didn't happen. Of course, it was very painful for tens of thousands of people. What happened in Ukraine is different because we consider that the Ukrainian army is a friendly army, so we're not thinking about confronting this army. And as I said, this step we took is against the extremists. It's because of the extremists.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about the importance of Crimea, but is this battle just about protecting the geopolitical interests of Russia, or is it also about protecting the historical and religious idea of the Russian nation?
Of course, we have Russian interests, but at the same time, we have brotherly ties with the people. And so we are protecting them in Ukraine. The goal is to stop the escalation in Ukraine and to stabilize the situation in Ukraine. This is the most important issue.
Let's go back to November of last year and the way that this whole crisis started. The then President Viktor Yanukovych decided to snub a trade agreement with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Moscow. Moscow in turn offered Ukraine $15 billion in aid, as well as gas discounts, as I'm sure you know. But nevertheless, we still saw protests erupt in Kiev, tens of thousands of people. How do you explain that?
Yes, this is the conspiracy. And we believe that this was all planned.
Planned by who?
They played the economic card, the issue of trade, in order to reach all of these goals, the political goals and the other goals as well. So it was in order to go ahead with the coup d'etat or with the ousting of the regime. So this was it, trying to exaggerate the issue of the trade in order to achieve the strategic goals.
So essentially, what is that meant to achieve in the long term?
As I said, they want Ukraine to be, for example, politically, to be an ally of the West, economically, to be a partner with the EU, and from the security perspective, also, they want Ukraine to be with them. Now, we're hearing all of their calls, the calls made by the new authority in Ukraine about American assistance or Western assistance.
Yeah, but if what you're saying is indeed correct, that signals that Russia and Russian interests are under constant attack from the West.
Of course, when they see that there is an opportunity to expand and to intervene, they take advantage of this opportunity. They took advantage of this opportunity, they took advantage of what took place in Ukraine, and unfortunately they took advantage of the extremists, whom are considered, even in some European countries, like Poland, who are considered members or part of the Nazi movement.
So how do you respond to people who argue that the neo-Nazi movement was very limited in its actions against the Yanukovych government, that its role wasn't that significant to begin with?
Every faction has its role, played its role. We have the opposition in the parliament. We see them now, they are represented in the government, and there was also a role played by these groups. They are limited, yes, they are quite small in number, but in such circumstances, when we have protests, they are active. For example, 50 people or 100 people, a small number, but they could seize control and create havoc and chaos. For example, the snipers. Snipers could kill people, and so irrespective of what they represent, of the fact that they have a small representation or a small percentage, but in such circumstances, they play a very important role.
You know, there's something that's not clear to me watching these events unfold over the last couple of months. How could Russia allow something like this to happen in its own backyard, to lose a strategic partner like the Yanukovych government in a country like Ukraine? You said that Western powers saw an opportunity, they saw a space, and they took that opportunity. Why hasn't Russia stepped forward and tried to prevent that from happening earlier?
We don't intervene in the internal affairs of a country, and we believe that these issues were related between, it was about relations between the ruling authority and the opposition. So we took the stance of not intervening, but we expected others to take the same stance. But when it was proven that they have daily intervention from Europe, and when we found that they encourage the protesters and encourage the opposition to reject dialogue with the ruling authority and also to reject any agreement, when we saw this happening, we took a political stance, but we were not able to behave in the same way they behaved. And something else is we don't have allies like these people who were in the square protesting. So when the coup took place, and then it was clear that there is a long-term strategy in order to bring about permanent change in Ukraine, when this became clear, and when it became clear that this led to very negative repercussions on millions of people, then we took this decision.
You said that you couldn't behave the way that the West behaves, that you couldn't do what they do, that they have the allies on the ground. What do you mean exactly by that? Are you saying that Western powers exert more influence in Ukraine than Russia does?
No, but there are different means. And we didn't encourage protests in Arab countries and the so-called revolutions in Europe or elsewhere. It seems that lately this is the main tool they resort to, the Western countries, pushing people to protest. We saw this in a number of countries in Europe or in the Middle East. We stand against such behavior. We ourselves don't resort to such means.
We also saw protests in Moscow itself. Are those fueled by Western powers?
The protests in Moscow for some time now, we have an opposition in the country. However, it's quite a very small percentage, this opposition. It represents a small percentage, and there is no popular support for these protests. And we have a strong ruling government and a strong authority in Russia. And so we don't expect anything to happen. Even provocations or provocative acts, we don't even expect this to happen. And the people don't support this group. In Ukraine, the situation is different because we have more problems, more internal problems in Ukraine. The mood, the public mood of the people was again very much against the ruling government, the former ruling government. And so many of the protesters were actually supportive. And something else is that they used illegitimate means. And so we believe that this does not serve the interests of the country. And it's clear that the West encouraged and also the extremists, the information you can read on the internet states very clearly that these extremists were encouraged by the West.
If if this is the new method that Western powers are using, these protest movements, encouraging extremist factions that are operating within certain states illegally or legally, is Russia putting in place countermeasures in its own country and in other regional allies? For instance, Belarus, could we see a similar situation develop there?
No. In principle, we are against such procedures, such behavior. We don't deal with people in the same manner. As I said, the decision taken by the Russian parliament is to control the situation, to stabilize the situation. The decision taken by the Russian parliament was not to bring about escalation.
You called the current self-proclaimed leadership, if you will, in Kiev illegitimate. And Russian President Vladimir Putin said that the legitimate leader of Ukraine is, in fact, ousted President Viktor Yanukovych. Are the Russians going to work to reinstall Yanukovych in power?
Yanukovych left the country, and we all believe that his support, his popularity is very low, and he is still a president, legally speaking. However, in the future, we don't know, because this depends on the peoples in Ukraine, not the opinion of Russia. Now we hear from in different places that they still recognize Yanukovych as a president. These areas in Ukraine who recognize Yanukovych as such, will they grow, for example? Will this opinion spread in the future? We don't know. But with regards to the legal situation in Ukraine, it's very ambiguous, the legal framework. Partially, we can say there is legitimacy for this person or that person. It's all partial. It's not clear. The legitimacy is the president, parliament, and the judiciary. Now, for example, the judges, what is happening is not part of the constitution, is against the judicial constitution. So what we find is that the influence of the local authorities is stronger than it was before in the west and the east of the country.
Let's talk about Crimea a little bit, where a lot of this crisis seems to be centered on at the moment. Russia has over 20,000 troops stationed in Crimea. In terms of its strategic importance, Russia will never really let Crimea go, will it?
Crimea, ever since 1954, Crimea was part of Ukraine, and it still is.
But it doesn't want to be. It doesn't seem like it wants to be, and Russia seems to be backing the separatist sentiment, if you will, inside Crimea?
هناك حكم الذاتي وهو ممكن يكون بصلاحيات أكثر أو أقل. الآن لديهم الاستفتاء بنهاية الشهر لإيجاد الصيغة لصلاحيات الحكم الذاتي. نحن لا نتدخل بهذا الاستفتاء ونحن فقط ننتظر النتائج. ولكن أكيد أنه
we are sure that Crimea will stay part of Ukraine, as part of Ukraine.
Well, what about the Russian troops that have taken up positions across Crimea, surrounding Ukrainian military bases, taking strategic airports and seaports and other administrative buildings, if you will?
This issue is related today, is related most of all to the media war. It's being focused on in the media, on the TV screens, and also on the Western media we see images of soldiers. It's exaggerated, actually. And to speak objectively, all of the troops are part of the naval fleet to guard the Russian naval fleet, and we are afraid of any provocations which could be made against the Russian fleet, and so we are enhancing the guarding or protection of this naval fleet within the framework of the naval agreement. However, it seems that the Western media likes to focus very much on these images of Russian troops.
But Russian troops expanding, leaving their bases and expanding their presence in Crimea, isn't that a violation of the agreement between Kiev and Moscow?
First of all, regarding the presence of self-defense, they are there for self-defense, and we are also enhancing our protective measures, but in the areas which are agreed upon within the framework of the naval agreement.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, unfortunately we are running out of time here. If I can get your final thoughts, where do we go from here, and what does Ukraine look like in the coming months and years?
There are many different factors and many different problems in Ukraine, and some of it requires dialogue between the Ukrainians. Other problems require dialogue between the neighboring countries, Russia, Europe, and America, and others. One point is they now want to give the impression that Russia is responsible for this, and so Russia must take the initiative in order to find a solution. We say that this language of warnings is not beneficial, has no use, and so we must work on equal footing, and those who are responsible for this situation, they are the ones who first and foremost must think how to bring about a solution. There are other economic problems, problems which are considered long-term problems, and this will also require efforts, and we are ready to provide assistance, and we believe that the others also should take part in this process.
Well, unfortunately, on that note, we have run out of time on this special edition of Between the Lines. I would, of course, like to thank my guest, His Excellency Alexander Zasipkin. He is the Russian ambassador to Beirut. Thank you for being here with us today. And, of course, thank you for watching. Don't forget that you can catch us again at the same time next week. For now, goodbye.
What can be a reason to use the armed forces? This is of course the last resort, simply the last resort. If we see the lawlessness starting in eastern regions too, if people ask us for help, and we have already an official address.